Good morning. This is Senator Dick Black, retired senator. We are at Monday, November the 6th. Today's topic is going to be the split over Israel, which is threatening Biden's reelection. But before we do that, and I've got a very important guest who will be coming on in just a minute, but I want to touch on two topics first and do these very briefly. The first one is this. We have a court case out of Connecticut, and it deals with the Democratic primary for mayor of Bridgeport. Bridgeport's the largest city in Connecticut, and what has happened is that the judge has reviewed evidence that shows two women stuffing heaps of ballots into drop boxes, which of course are unattended, and these things are basically designed to facilitate voter fraud across the country. And the judge, Superior Court Judge William Clark, entered a ruling in which he determined that there was so much evidence that the court simply cannot determine a legitimate result for the election. And he said, and I quote, "The volume of ballots so mishandled is such that it calls the result of the primary election into serious doubt and leaves the court unable to determine the legitimate result of the primary." Now, This is how the presidential election was decided in 2020. It was with this type of massive voter fraud where you have one person who will go in and stuff in 1,000 ballots. All of a sudden, you shift the vote tally by 1,000 votes with a single person going in and just dumping these garbage ballots into these drop boxes, the voter fraud boxes. Here's the lesson. America today has the most crooked elections in the world. No one knows who votes. Nobody knows how many times they vote. So that's something to digest a little bit. Let me get into our second quick topic, and that is the fact that there was quite a stunning disclosure by Ukraine's top general, General Zaluzny, highly respected. He's done a very impressive job of fighting the war with what Ukraine has to fight with. And he has admitted that the war is now at a stalemate. In other words, all of the talk about this great Ukrainian counteroffensive and all these wonder weapons coming in from the West have gone for nothing. The French press service, AFP, ran a headline that read, "We're losing. Ukrainians reel from war chief's stalemate warning." Now, President Zelensky of Ukraine was furious over this. And because of that, General Zaluzny was publicly chastised and humiliated for making this remark, which Zelensky said has caused panic among Ukraine's Western allies. Now, until this election is finished, until the presidential election is finished in November, it is vital for the Democrats that no one admit that Ukraine has lost the war. And this is what's causing such chaos. The lesson here, the war in Ukraine is lost, and all of America's treasure that has been dumped in there has been squandered. Okay, so with those two quick topics, let me shift over. And I want to introduce to you Diane Sare. Diane, if we can bring you on. We we have this split over Israel, which appears to be threatening Biden's reelection. Um, Let me just tell our viewers that Diane Sare is the candidate for United States Senate in New York, and she ran against Chuck Schumer in the election last time, and she is a magnificent candidate, a very, very bright, very impressive woman, very knowledgeable about these foreign affairs and so forth. Diane, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts about what's happening on the world stage right now.
Well, thank you, Senator Black, for having me. I think if you put together your first report with what we're now discussing about Biden's quote unquote re-election, there's plenty of ground to wonder whether he actually got elected the first time. Yeah. So, I think I'm working on writing something which has been somewhat tormenting me because I think the United States is urgently needed on the world stage today, but not as the dumb giant of the British colonial system, but as the representative of the intention of Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Quincy Adams, what Kennedy called, quoting from scripture, a light on a hill. We have lost our way, and we now have a situation where, I hate to say it, but not one single one of these presidential candidates is comporting himself or herself along the lines of the intention of our republic. If you think back to the Oslo Accords in 1993, the reason why this was possible, with all of his various flaws and shortcomings, President Bill Clinton was very popular. People felt a sort of confidence in his leadership. He was able to provide strong leadership, and Rabin and Arafat, two warriors who had been involved in killing each other's people. Rabin talked about the anguish, something I'm sure you know all too well and personally, of talking to mothers, saying not being able to look in their eyes when you're burying their sons, that he said, this has to end. And a voice like that is needed right now from the United States. And instead, we have a very nasty, criminal, senile, old man who is doing nothing to stop the bloodshed or to have a policy for a calm and reasoned approach to this unfolding crisis, which is obviously gut-wrenching with the completely disproportionate Israeli response, the attacks on hospitals, schools, ambulances. A huge number of children have died. And I understand in Israel, about 60% of the population now oppose the actions in Gaza, whereas that number had supported it initially, or now I think the percentage of people who actually support it is down to 20%, because it doesn't benefit Israel's security to become the most hated nation on the planet because you're carrying out war crimes. How does that make anything more stable? And I think people there can see it. So where is Biden in all of this? Completely bungling, incompetent, no sane policy, no strong leadership. If we had free and fair elections, one, I don't think he would be here in the first place. Two, I think he would definitely be out.
You know, it is remarkable that President Biden seems so harsh in his support for this unlimited bombing campaign. he seems to just be absolutely heartless. Because what we're seeing, you know, during World War II, we absolutely bombed our enemies into rubble. And of course, the atomic bombs at the end were something for a totally different topic. But the bombs being dropped back then typically were 250-pound bombs. That's very common. And what we're doing in not we and the Israelis are doing the bombing. We're supplying the bombs, and we're using 2,000-pound bombs in many instances, which are huge. I only dropped them once during the Vietnam War. This is out of well over 1,000 bombs that I controlled. But I will tell you, I later saw the results, and a 2,000-pound bomb makes a crater that is large enough to park a large car inside the crater. These are enormous, and I don't think anyone is confused by the fact that the vast majority, I would say at a bare minimum, 9 out of 10 people being killed in Gaza are civilians. That is at a bare minimum, and that's an exaggeration of how many Hamas soldiers are being killed. It's not 1 out of 10. It's fewer than that, but at least at minimum, 90% of the people being killed are just innocent civilians who have nothing to do with this. So you would think, at a minimum, from his secure vantage point here back in the United States, that President Biden would show some degree of human empathy for the suffering taking place. And I just found it rather stunning, just his iron, angry, unflinching determination. And I will tell you that I think that for many within the deep state, both in the United States and Israel, their view is that they will cut off the northern half of this tiny Gaza Strip. It will never go back to the Palestinians, and they will further compress what remains of them into this tiny, tiny area that will just be teeming with humanity, laying on top of one another. Someone at least has to exhibit some measure of sympathy towards the civilians who are dying there.
Well, I think what's really not spoken here, and I concur with your characterization of Biden, and will also say that that kind of demeanor is a symptom of dementia. But I think he was a very nasty, cold-hearted person even before he was senile. So
Yeah.
that's neither here nor there. Look, what is being left out of the equation in the Western press, and some people think it has perhaps more to do with this or on a lower level, is the BRICS process, right? The Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Now at the last meeting in South Africa has expanded, and you can look at a map to include Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, the United Arab Emirates, and possibly Argentina, depending on the election outcomes there. This is an entirely new dynamic. And once again, getting back to my earlier point, if the United States were acting according to our anti-colonial revolutionary identity, we would embrace the idea that nations so clearly with totally different political systems, religious backgrounds, language, cultures, can nonetheless come together and say, you know what, we'd like to trade with each other. We'd like to eradicate poverty. We're not going to meddle in your internal affairs and put on our mightier than thou robes and come in and tell you how superior we are. Uh, this is an extraordinary new system, which my mentor, Lyndon LaRouche, frankly, had a great deal to do with all of his meetings with Indira Gandhi, Lopez Portillo, leaders of the Global South back in the 70s and 80s, which unfortunately at the time, Henry Kissinger and others had a bit too much power. So people got assassinated, it was thwarted. But now you're at a point where, because Russia has been able to successfully resist the provocation for which Ukraine is getting ground up by the West, China has developed in a spectacular way. China's 1.4 billion people. Russia has more advanced weapons than we do in the United States. You now have an option for nations. And I think we also have to admit that being an ally of the United States doesn't work. So why would you, if your best friend is going to poke your eyes out and kick you in the crotch, and, why do you need enemies? And I think we have to look at all those nations that have been the alleged allies of the United States and see how they're doing, to see why someone might rather work with this new configuration. And I think that's what's playing out here. Now, the State Department has proposed this other corridor, which is supposedly a counter to the Belt and Road and the BRICS process. And they want to grab some land for various pipelines and this and that. I'm sure that's a factor, but I think greed and self promotion are actually on the lower level. This is just venal people who can easily be sucked in. I think on the higher level, you have this British ideology, which is an end game, the idea that human beings are nothing but animals, that you are born to rule because of your bloodline or whatever, and the ruling elites get to use everyone else as chattel and cattle and chattel, called the herd, depopulate, enslave. That's a view held by every empire. Doesn't work. The empires always collapse of their own weight, but that system is dying. And again, the United States should be on the side of our founding fathers in this, and we could make a very beautiful transition. But because we have now been dominated by these neocons and very corrupt, venal people, and then a lot of younger people who simply don't have a clue of the world or history or geography, we are acting to somehow enforce or impose a criminal, dying system that the majority of the world's people don't want. And at the moment, the civilian population of Gaza is paying a very heavy toll for this.
Yeah, let me say, and I'm sure that you join me in this. The thing that initially triggered this, the attack by Hamas, was absolutely horrific. It was a terrible crime against the 1,400 Israelis who were killed, and there is no justification under any circumstance for doing it. So that's not at issue. But what is at issue is that the response by Israel, which was, to some extent, I think, a justified reprisal. You have the question of how much is enough. How far do you go? How many innocent people can die in response to other innocent people dying? And that's an issue. Now, I think it's fascinating watching the American politics of this unfold, because I was quite surprised to get a report from our mutual friend Pat Salisbury, and she said this was about a week ago or so, and she said there's a large Jewish American demonstration in the Capitol in favor of the Palestinians. And I actually asked her twice, because this was a little bit difficult to comprehend at this particular moment in time. She assured me, yes, it's organized by the Jewish community, and while it has a lot of other people, the leadership of it is the Jewish community in D.C. Well, so what now has happened is the Democratic Party exists as this coalition of various slices of American society, and you have the whole array of ethnic slices, but what you have now is you've got various factions that are bitterly at war with one another. The Jewish community is under political attack by Muslims, by Black Lives Matter, by unions, by all of the other Democrat elements. And at the same time, large Jewish contributors make up over half of the funds that are raised by the Democrats for a presidential campaign. So Biden is in this dilemma where if he does not give complete carte blanche to Israel to bomb the Palestinians into oblivion in the Gaza Strip, he may lose his funding for the political race. On the other hand, he already has plunging poll numbers because he is offending so many other people within the Democratic Party. It's a great political dilemma to him, and I think perhaps were he a little more guided by morals and a little less by expediency, he might find a practical solution to it. But it certainly has put the Democratic Party into disarray, hasn't it?
Yes, for sure. And I think on your earlier point on this horrific attack launched by Hamas on October 7th, that it's really important also to consider how this could have been allowed to occur, given that Israel has one of the best intelligence services in the world. And this was not a tiny attack with a couple people who hopped over a fence or something. It was long planned, skillfully executed. There are rumors that there were warnings from Egypt. I don't know if that's true or not. But if you look at the timing of it, it definitely was very helpful to Biden, who, as you said, depends on a Ukrainian victory against Russia, which is never going to happen. Ukraine's offensive failed miserably. So it was a great way of changing the subject. Bibi Netanyahu was facing prison time, possibly, had tens of thousands of IDF soldiers protesting him in the streets because he wants to reorganize the judiciary to stay out of jail, apparently. So I think, and I know some of the demonstrations against Netanyahu going on today in Israel are raising exactly this question. They're very angry, saying, why was this horrific attack not prevented? How could this have been allowed to occur? And it calls to mind what happened here in the United States on September 11th, where it's very easy to run around the world and bomb people But there's a glaring question, which is how can you have, I don't know how many airplanes were hijacked that day. How can you have multiple airplanes hijacked, flying off course? No jets are scrambled to stop them. The air to surface or surface to air missiles at the Pentagon are somehow disabled. And the Osama bin Laden family and a bunch of Saudis all got on airplanes and fly out of the United States the following day. You know, and LaRouche wrote a memo, which I find extremely useful, and we really should reflect on, called Shoot the Neighbor's Cat, 4 days after this, where he talks about a guy comes home, finds his house has been robbed. And I think maybe this is often the case. I don't know. I'm not a burglar, but probably often the burglar stays in the house, you know, hiding behind the couch or somewhere in there. Maybe you got home in the middle of the act. So the husband takes out his shotgun, shoots the next door neighbor's cat in a total rage fit. And the wife says, honey, that's just the neighbor's cat. And he's so worked up and so enraged, he says, get out of my way or I'll shoot you too. And LaRouche said CNN and the American news media in the wake of 9/11 were serving to inflame the American people against people who couldn't possibly, you know, Osama bin Laden had kidney failure. He'd been in the American hospital, I think in Dubai or somewhere in July. Some guy from a cave in Afghanistan is not coordinating such a massive attack. And LaRouche said, if you don't actually insist on getting to the bottom of this, that burglar is going to be lurking there, waiting for another opportunity. And I think these questions have to be, Israel has a legitimate concern for security. Absolutely. How do you ensure security? Well, one important way would be to figure out what went wrong and how this attack actually occurred. And I think we do have to look at the cui bono, who benefits from this, because unfortunately we see all too often, and you already mentioned about Biden's callousness, and I'm not saying he did it or order it. I'm just saying these are questions that should be asked. And if you find yourself in a situation where you're advocating putting people's heads on stakes, as Vivek Ramaswamy called for, then probably you've gone over the edge. Something is probably very wrong.
Well, it is interesting. Seymour Hersh, who's a very respected Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, probably the preeminent national affairs and international affairs and military affairs journalist of our time. He did one of his articles shortly after this, and he disclosed that Netanyahu had ordered the removal of 2 of the 3 battalions that defended the border with the Gaza Strip. And that left only 800 Israeli soldiers to guard a lengthy strip of border, which essentially left the border undefended. There, for all practical purposes, three battalions was enormously inadequate to begin with, and then he took 2/3 of that and essentially left nothing. And even the one battalion appears not to have been on any sort of a heightened alert status after these other battalions had been removed. So Netanyahu attempted to blame the military for unpreparedness. And when he did, he got such a backlash that he had to apologize publicly because, and again, according to Seymour Hersh, the Israeli high command had advised Netanyahu against removing these battalions from the border. And so you have to look at that, and you can say, you know, on the one hand, you can say potentially this was inviting something that would create a huge backblast and enable Netanyahu to do the types of things he likes to do. He's a very bloodthirsty leader. On the other hand, you could say here you had a man, Netanyahu, who was enormously reckless, foolish, and one man's blunder, his gargantuan, unforgivable blunder, caused the deaths of all of these people. Either way, Netanyahu needs to be out of office, and I certainly hope that the administration would give its full support to the opposition and remove this clown from office once and for all. Israel desperately needs new leadership because, you know, in the end, they will pulverize the Gaza Strip. They will set its people back 100 years. 100 years. It's going to take 100 years to rebuild what the Israelis are able to destroy. And you can say, okay, well, good. Here we go. We picked up a little extra piece of land. We now annex the northern part of the Gaza Strip. And so, you know, good for us, Israel. We've done this, but the problem is, and I think many Israelis of goodwill recognize, you cannot continue poking people in the eye with a sharp stick indefinitely. And the entire world has turned so negative towards Israel because of this. And they just, under Netanyahu, they have not been attempting to normalize relations with their neighbors in a very substantive way. So there, in the end, I think probably many, you know, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Palestinians will die of exposure, of starvation, of all the things that happen when you bomb a civilization into oblivion. There may be some temporary gain for Israel in that, but in the long run, I think it undermines the future of Israel, because the world is not going to forget what's happening there. And so we'll see where it leads, but certainly President Biden hasn't done much to help the situation.
No, and neither have any of the presidential candidates. You know, there's a point of having an opposition, having a presidential voice where you put forward an alternative policy, or you remind the world of the anniversary of the Rabin assassination, which is 2 days ago, the 28th anniversary. Netanyahu was the guy who said Rabin had violated the faith and, you know, was attacking him viciously, verbally, immediately after the Oslo Accords. It was recent enough that many of the older generation in both Israel and the occupied territories in Gaza, West Bank remember this. I just read a report from a French journalist who was there, and he said as soon as Arafat and Rabin shook hands, he saw the Palestinian children running and hugging the IDF soldiers. There was such jubilation and goodwill. And I think if we can change immediately, I hope we can prevent hundreds of thousands of people from dying on the course we're on. We're headed that way. It's an absolute horror. But if the U.S. would come to its senses somehow, some alternative voice, this peace movement on a higher level, and say, look, let's stop trying to sabotage the new paradigm. Let's work with China. Let's work with Russia. Do you realize how quickly China could rebuild the whole region if they were involved? If you look at the pace of the cities they've built, or I don't know, 50,000 kilometers of high-speed rail in 10 years. If you had a coalition of powerful nations that said to the people on the ground, cut it out. We need to go back to the UN resolution 242. We've got to end the occupation. We need a Palestinian state. That's your best bet for security and stability. And we're going to have an economic program that's going to get everybody on their feet. And that was Rabin's image. He said, all of us, the Palestinian people, the Israelis, the Jordanians, we can become a powerhouse of economic productivity. And that is really, we have to have a vision, something like that of the future of where we're headed.
That was a great moment, the signing of the 1993 Oslo Accords, which by which essentially there were two elements. One is that the PLO, which was the governing body for the Palestinians, recognized the state of Israel, which was a momentous event. And the other thing is that Israel recognized that there should be a separate Palestinian state, and they didn't define the exact borders or anything, but clearly that was the objective. The two-state solution is absolutely essential, because the way that it's operating now is that the deep state, whether it's Biden, whether it's Israel, they've operated almost.
I just thought we should call Biden the shallow state. Sorry.
but they pretend that somehow the Palestinian people will evaporate from the face of the earth. They give them no land. The Israeli settlers were a very extremist, hate-filled group of people. They've killed 200 before the Hamas event. They had killed, I think, about 200 Palestinians who are just simply living in their homes, in their lands, and the Israelis come in, they cut off their access to this and that, and then they steal their property. It is simply legalized theft, condoned by the Netanyahu administration, and it's just unforgivable. The Palestinians must have a precisely delineated state which is recognized internationally as the nation of Palestine, and it needs to be free of sanctions and blockades and all of this other garbage that we constantly torture people with. Well, Diane, I'll give you just 1 minute, and then we will close at that point.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure speaking with you. I would just say that we have to have in our hearts the faith that mankind is better, and we have to act from that standpoint. And it is absolutely gut-wrenching to see this willful genocide unfolding, but we can resolve that not one of these lives will have been in vain if we can succeed in moving the human race into a new paradigm, which I just have to stress depends on the American people, depends on the United States. So please rise to the occasion.
Well, thank you very much. I wish that I could vote for you. You would certainly have my vote.
Thank you.
But in any event, thank you very much for joining us today. And to all of our visitors, you can always reach us. The Twitter address is @SEN Richard Black. And we will be back next Monday. This has been Focus on the News.